Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode, the final episode of the season of Second Nature, Living with Ecological Grief and Loss. Friends, we have something so special for you today. For our last episode, I am beyond thrilled to be welcoming Frances Weller, internationally renowned psychotherapist, writer, and soul activist, to our show. For over 40 years, Frances has been practicing soul-centered psychotherapy, assisting thousands of people along their emotional, psychological, and spiritual journeys. A gifted therapist and teacher, Frances speaks widely on the topics of grief, loss, sorrow, ritual, and renewal to move us through judgment and shame. He's a master of synthesizing diverse streams of thought from psychology and anthropology and mythology and alchemy and indigenous cultures and poetic traditions. He is the author of one of my all-time favorite books, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief. He's also the author of The Threshold Between Loss and Revelation and In the Absence of the Ordinary, Essays in a Time of Uncertainty. Through these works and his teachings and his speakings, he's introduced the healing work of ritual to thousands and thousands of people around the world. He founded and directs Wisdom Bridge, an organization that offers educational programs that seek to integrate the wisdom from Indigenous cultures with the insights and knowledge gathered from Western poetic, psychological, and spiritual traditions. Frances has a BA from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay and 2 master's degrees from John F. Kennedy University in clinical psychology and transpersonal psychology. His writings have appeared in anthologies and journals exploring the confluence between the psyche, nature, and culture. His work is featured widely in all sorts of publications and media, and he was recently a guest on season 2 of All There Is with Anderson Cooper, which I highly recommend and have listened to it multiple times. And he's currently completing his 4th book, which I'm sure we can't all wait to read, Facing the World with Soul and Why It Matters. And for our regular listeners, you will know how influential Frances's works, thoughts, and books, particularly The Wild Edge of Sorrow, have been on myself, but also for all the guests on this show. It's just such an honor and an absolute gift to be in conversation with you today, Frances. And I am so delighted and so happy and so thrilled and full of gratitude to be able to welcome you here today to Second Nature.
What a beautiful welcome. I'm deeply touched and honored to be here with you, Ashlee, as well. Thank you.
And I really want to start our conversation with gratitude. I have really embarked on this journey of this podcast in much part because of you, and having these conversations with people all over the world was so important to me because I've been so, I think, isolated and so alone in my own grief. And since 2009, when I started working in these areas and looking at the grief that people were feeling in response to the natural world, I think that my coping mechanism, because I couldn't hold all the sorrow, was to try to think my way through and to write my way through and to research my way through so that I didn't have to feel. And it wasn't until your book came out and I started to read it where I realized I am not feeling this. I am not having that relationship with grief. And instead, I'm trying to separate out. I'm trying to intellectualize it. I'm not metabolizing it. And part of your call to us is to create community and to reach out and to be vulnerable and to not be alone in our grief. And that is so much of the reason why I started Second Nature and why I'm having these conversations with people for my own grief, but to bring us into community. And I want to thank you for that. And thank you for what you've given to me, what you've given to the world, what you've given to us, and that lesson of not being alone in our isolation and in our grief.
That's such a critical piece that you bring in there, Ashlee, because having been a therapist, as you say, for 40 plus years, the central issue in everyone's life is loss, is sorrow, whether it's loss of a childhood or a marriage or a child or a friendship or a home. But now we're also feeling the erosion of the land beneath us, right? The whole ecological structure is beginning to really be impacted by the changes of our climate. And we haven't had a language for that in terms of grief. We didn't even really know how to acknowledge that. When I first began leading grief rituals in the late 90s, maybe 1 or 2 people who came to the rituals were talking about the sorrows of the world. Now it's well over half to 2/3 of the people are there because of the grief that they're feeling for the ravages that are happening to their watersheds, to the, to the species, to whatever else they can acknowledge that the grief of the world is in the room now in such a palpable way. And we have no collective means of addressing that. So most of the time, like you just said, we end up carrying it very privately. And this is too big a grief to carry alone.
I love that phrase that the grief of the world is now in the room. And I feel that so much in so many of the conversations that people are having, and so much of how people are looking at the world now is this grief-filled lens,
Right.
and this sort of emotio-spiritual psychic break from the natural world, and the emptiness and the pain that comes from that, and the helplessness of not being able to do more for what is happening around us.
Well, I think part of the real trouble is that this is unresolvable grief. We're not going to resolve this grief. And so how do you carry that? How do you walk with that on a day-by-day basis? Particularly if, again, we're sentenced to do that in private. So we have to distract, we have to avoid, we have to defend against the reality, because this is, like I say, it's an unresolvable grief. We're not going to see the resolution of this. We've entered what I call the long dark. And the long dark could be several generations, if we make it. There's not even any guarantee anymore of our continuation as a species. But if we make it, it might be at least 2 generations before we're able to feel like we've arrived someplace other than where we stand right now. Because where we stand right now is at the precipice of extinction. That's a terrifying thought. How do you hold that? How do you walk with that grief? That, my grandchildren may not see the world that I grew up in. I know they won't. So how do I hold that? And what do I need to hold that? And that's where my work has been focused on, primarily restoring the primal matrix for attending to grief, which is communal. We've always done this communal. We've never done this privately until very, very recently in our story, and it doesn't work.
That's something that struck me. I mean, I've read your book so many times, and it's interesting because there are moments in time since I've had it. Well, I came out in 2015, so almost 10 years, that I go back and forth to it, where all of a sudden I'm called to it and I read it again with fresh eyes and fresh experience, and I see different things. And even in our first episode of the show, I read several quotes around what led me along the journey. But you open your book with a quote from Kathleen Dean Moore, and it's always something that has struck me that I have to remind myself. And the quote is that sorrow is part of the earth's great cycles, flowing into the night like cool air sinking down a river course. To feel sorrow is to float on the pulse of the earth, the surge from living to dying, from coming into being to ceasing to exist. Maybe this is why the earth has the power over time to wash sorrow into a deeper pool, cold and shadowed. And maybe this is why, even though sorrow never disappears, it can make a deeper connection to the currents of life and so connect somehow to the sources of wonder and solace. And for me, that is what your work does. It carries us on the pulses of the earth, and it connects us more deeply to the solace and the sorrows, to the joy and the pain. And I think that moving those lessons now into how are we dealing with the ecological destruction, the degradation, the disappearance, is where your work is resonating so broadly, as well as all of the other losses that we face and all of the other losses to come.
Yeah, I feel like we won't respond to the world and the crisis we're in out of some sense of obligation. We will do it because of love, because of affection. Wendell Berry, the wonderful poet, farmer, said that it all turns on affection. But how do we get to our affection? Because if we don't move the sorrow, if we don't address our grief, we can't access that affection. In a sense, what happens when we repress grief or avoid grief is that the heart freezes. It congeals and hardens in the heart and becomes a place that's almost impenetrable. And then the warmth of our affection for the world cannot move out. nor can we really continue to drink in its astonishing beauty that's still there. So to register the beauty, to register our affection, grief becomes a threshold emotion for that. If we have the means by which we can touch the sorrow, the heart can remain fluid and responsive and engaged with the living world. And that's what we need now more than ever, is our affection, our care, our devotion, a quality of fidelity to our watersheds, to protect what is still there. And again, not out of moralism, but out of profound affection for what is there. And that comes through the gate of the heart.
When I read your book for the first time and I got to the section on the 5 gates of grief, and I hit the third one, and I was so struck, so emotionally moved. I cried so many times through your book. It was so visceral. But the third gate is the sorrows of the world. And in this section, you talk about sort of this cumulative grief that we have for the world and how overwhelming it is, and that we're not separate, and that it is actually a profound spiritual responsibility to acknowledge the loss of others, and to really see our connection to the more than humans and all the beings that we share the world with, that we share the cosmos with. And that maybe you have a line that says, maybe the soul of the world is weeping through us. And even now talking about it, I just get the visceral, I feel so emotional around it. And I was so struck. And I always come back to the third gate, because I think it's something so needed at this time, but something in grief journeys that we don't often talk about, that it's, we kind of skip the sorrows of the world and look at the other things. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about the third gate and this profound grief that we have with our loss of connection to the natural world.
Yeah, again, that's what comes in the room in the grief ritual gatherings, or even in my office now. The attention isn't always to the interior of our lives, our personal losses, but the exterior, the world around us is coming in to our bodies, into our psyches, and to our experiences of loss and grief. So there's 2 things about this third gate. One of them is obviously the fact that our bodies are inseparable from what is happening to our immediate terrain, what's happening to vacant lots and neighborhoods and the salmon population. Like there was no salmon fishing again this year off the coast of California because the runs are just too weak, too thin. So, and I wake up in the mornings. When I first moved into this house 22 years ago, I used to complain to my wife about the 5 a.m. cacophony of birdsong. That they'd be waking me up. God, now I'm grateful to hear 1 or 2 birds singing in the morning. Where did they go? So you begin to notice, maybe not by direct observation, but you begin to hear the silences, the emptinesses that are not filled with the life that once was. The second part of this third gate grief is our loss of the world. We don't think about the world. We think about economics. We think about politics. We think about, my survival, my economic survival. But we don't, the thought of the world, in a sense, is faded from our imagination. And consequently, we don't feel the immediacy of what is happening to the terrain in our own flesh. It comes more by mood, by dream, by impression. There's a passage I quote from Paul Shepard in the book. Paul Shepard was he called himself a human biologist, and he was studying the grand sweep of human beings from the Paleolithic to the current. And he said something about just how much we've lost as a consequence of moving from what he called a sacramental cosmos to a sacrificial cosmos. We once were a part of a world that was saturated with significance, of holiness. And that was removed gradually by various things, including agriculture and then technology and so forth. But he was being interviewed one time, and I can't remember the question, but his answer floored me, and I have shared it so many places, including my book, which was, he said, the grief and sense of loss that we often attribute to a failure in our personality is actually a feeling of emptiness, where a beautiful and strange otherness should have been encountered. Now, if we just sat with that one passage, we could weep for 1,000 years. What happened to the beautiful and strange otherness? Where's the fox? Where's the coyote? Where's the beetle? Where's the hawk? That beautiful and strange otherness has kind of faded. And now we're on the screens 24/7. We're, dealing with technology 24/7. We're not talking about the animate world anymore. Some people definitely are, but the majority of people are not. And so this grief and sense of loss is an emptiness in us. We've lost the world. And that emptiness can't be filled by money, by power, by rank, by privilege, by supremacies of any kind. Those are failures to really address what's at the heart of our sorrows, which is the fading of that immediacy, the intimacy with this singing world. And that grief, like I say, it may be the broken heart that saves our butts. It may be when we really can no longer deny what is happening to the planet, that we may actually start to respond in ways that are protective, are restorative, are reparative. That's at least why I'm doing what I'm doing.
That is such a profound, the idea of having the absence of the beautiful and strange otherness as driving so much of the loss.
I had one more thing there, Ashlee.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention that beautiful and strange otherness is meant to be seen in one another's eyes as well. That wildness, that aliveness has been replaced by a certain dullness and domestication, where we're just kind of trudging through our days. And so I want that beautiful and strange otherness should be seen in each other as well. And that's why, again, the grief work helps to reanimate that aliveness. It's paradoxical because our expectation on grief is that it's deadening, that it will depress us, it will flatten us. But what I've seen is just the opposite. When we engage it fully, we come alive again. And the goal is aliveness, not happiness. The goal is to be alive so we can participate in this life before we exit, which happens far sooner than I thought it was going to.
Yeah, and in like even your title, The Wild Edges of Sorrow, and that you talk about grief as feral energy, that is so, I think it so resonates with, well, certainly how I feel, but certainly many people that I've spoken to, is this movement inside of you that you feel like you can't contain the ferality of it, the ferocity that's there. And so, it comes up in all different ways, but it's wild, and you're trying to contain it and domesticate it when really you can't, that it needs to be wild. And then we need to learn to be wild with it. And what a profound shift in understanding that is, to try to follow the ferality of grief rather than trying to smother it and domesticate it and fill it up with other things that aren't healthy for us, because we're trying to tame this beast that we have inside that's trying to tell us something so profound about the world, but we're just not willing to listen, haven't learned how to listen, not able to listen.
That's beautifully said. Again, we have this expectation that somehow it's going to take us hostage and that we're going to somehow be depressed for the rest of our life if I open that gate. But again, in 40 plus years of working with people and 25 or so working with ritual, that's not what happens. We have so little faith in the rhythm and movement of sorrow. So we've learned to mistrust it. We've learned to kind of panic whenever it shows up. And frequently, because how many of us had our grief held when we were young? Very, very few of us. So whenever we get into that territory, get near it, some part of us panics. It's like I don't want to say never, but I've rarely seen a pure grief moment in somebody I've been sitting with. It's almost always a grief panic moment. They become so linked that the moment the grief comes up, there's this terror emerges as well, like I'm going to be in free fall and I'll never return. And I've heard that phrase so many times in my office that if I go there, I'm never coming back. And I say to them, if you don't go there, you're never coming back. Because some part of us spends our lifetime trying to keep this at bay, right? We just try to keep the grief from shattering our sense of okayness. But even that posture, even that movement is one that minimizes our aliveness. And that's not what the world needs right now.
I've heard you speak on different recordings and things in the past, and in your book as well, around hitting this moment in your own life where you realize that we're all performing, and I put myself in there too. That, performing, being good in your field, a good professional, a good human, a good man, all of these things, and I so resonate with that because I find myself, at 45 years old, feeling this, that for these decades, I've been performing all of the things that I felt I needed to do. And yet this ferality of grief is not going anywhere. And this sense of, if I do more of this type of thing, or if I research more on ecological grief, I'll somehow sort of metabolize my own, and sort of coming to this realization that it can't be contained. And until I start delving in, like plumbing the depths, instead of trying to write and get it out of me, that I'm not going to have this sense of full humanness, that I'm not going to be able to touch all of the levels of joy and sorrow and the awe, and that beautiful line around the beautiful and strange otherness, that I worry that I because of unresolved grief, that I'm losing or have lost the capacity to connect to the awe of the world, even though I talk about the awe and I talk about things and I write about them and I do all of these different teachings around them. But then I worry that in myself, I'm still performing this outward piece without really going in. And I found myself, particularly over the last sort of 6 months to a year, really kind of thinking about where I am as a human and in my relationship with grief. And that's why I always come back to your works too, is because I see so much of myself in this unresolved dance of trying to, thinking I'm working on it, but really I'm not touching it. And I think in many ways I am afraid of touching it too. I cry a lot, I weep a lot, but I don't go down into the depths that I think your work invites us to, and that your rituals invite us to. And it's an interesting moment in life to kind of hit that period of reckoning with oneself, with one's soul, with one's spirit, and what that means in the world in this particular time too, with everything that we're facing.
There's such a profound emphasis on control, being in control, being on top of it, not feeling vulnerable. And so much of that is rooted in this feeling of questionable belonging, right? I mean, it's like I have to continuously posture adequacy and competency, because if I don't show that, somehow I'm questioned in terms of my worthiness of belonging, of being inside the circle. So we end up performing our lives as a way to at least gain some kind of provisional welcome. Like, you've performed adequately, so we'll let you in, and at least you can sit in the back row, but at least we're in the door.
Not too close.
Not
Yeah.
too close. No. We haven't gotten that far. But the other problem is that, again, without cultural means by which to address this material, we're kind of the reinforcement is there on an ongoing basis to be in control. The last thing people want to do is fall apart. And that's the thing that we need to do right now, is fall apart. We need to be able to fall to our knees. We need to be able to hold one another. We need to be able to, in a sense, what I write about it in the chapter on ritual, is that we need to be able to become deranged periodically. And that's the wisdom I found in traditional cultures, is that they know how to contain the process of derangement. So we don't get hurt typically. We know how to fall apart in a way that allows for a rearrangement, because the current arrangement is not working frequently. We get caught in patterns of adaptation and conscription into the least layers of culture. And what ritual can do is loosen those constraints. Certain things can only happen in ritual space. And that's that place where I don't have to be the one managing myself in this moment. I am held. I can do the work I have to do. As you said, beautifully, Ashlee, is you feel yourself going downward, right? That's where grief takes us. It takes us into the depths, into the darkness. And we're not comfortable there. We like brightly lit places. We like things where we know everything that's going on. But this period of descent, which is also happening as a collective, as a species, as a planet, this period of descent is taking us into the territory of soul, and we almost have no language for soul. Depth, vulnerability, weakness, uncertainty, loss. Those are the languages of soul, and we want control, like I said, competence, success, rising, victory. We love those, but we don't know how to really stay open to the times of descent. And that's where we are right now.
One of the things that I think is so profound about the way that you write and speak about grief is that the minimal distance between loss and revelation, and how if we can go kind of into this grief, to go deep, to not be afraid of the dark, to push in, then we hit these revelatory points, and we have the awe, and we have the beautiful strangeness, otherness that is out there that is eluding us when we only kind of exist up here rather than kind of pushing in. And this idea that sorrow then becomes our true guide to being alive, that if we can follow sorrow, and if we can go with it and journey with it, and not be scared of it and not eschew it, and be held by others in this sorrow journey, then we are so much more able to hit a revelatory space than through any other emotion or any other pathway. And I find that sort of link that you then make to say it's our sacred duty, that this is truly what it means to be alive and to be human. And it's our sacred duty to ourselves and to others, all the others, not just human others, but all of the others, is just such a gift to the world that you've provided, but also such a true lesson in these times, as we watch so much disappear and so much change and so much suffering of all different bodies in this world, that it's still our sacred duty, that despite all of that, we need to follow this sacred duty.
Yeah, what if we are a kind of receptor site for the beauty and the sorrows of the world? What if it's part of our sacred obligation to be touched by what is around us, and then to speak on behalf of what's happening around us, both in gratitude but also in grief? As I wrote about driving up in Northern California, you inevitably come across clear cuts, just these swaths of utter devastation, where nothing is left standing but some twigs, some stumps. And it's, again, my job, my responsibility as a human being, to let that penetrate me and to feel that. I might not have answers for what to do with that, but if I don't register it, those sorrows, those losses go unacknowledged, as if they don't matter, as if what happened to the voles and the owls and the sorrel and the ferns and the tree, as if that doesn't matter. And so I think it is our spiritual responsibility to be vulnerable, or permeable, is probably a better word, permeable to the ways the world is speaking right now in all of its symptoms. This week has been, every day has been over 100 degrees. I don't know what that is in Celsius, but it's been hot. And the fires all around us. Over the past 5 or 6 years, my wife and I have had to evacuate our home twice, from encroaching fires. And these fires are exacerbated by the condition of the trees right now because of the lack of water initially. Now we've had some decent rain, but also because of the sicknesses in the trees. The bark beetles are weakening the trees so that the fire resistance is down. And so, I mean, the cascading effect of all of what's happening around us, it's my job, it's our job, yes, to feel that, to register that, and then to speak on behalf of what is happening.
When I was preparing for this conversation, I went back and revisited some of my favorite interviews that you've done over the years. And one with the Sounds of the Sand podcast, you made this statement that's just this weekend struck me so intensely, and it took my breath away. It was like going down to a deep spiritual kneel of that they were asking you the questions around what is happening with the dispossession and the destruction of the natural world, and what's the answer? What's the answer to move forward? And you said there is no answer, but there is a response. And even now, talking about it, I want to weep that there is no answer, but the response that we can give is this beautiful sacred duty of grief. And if that is all that we have left to give, what an incredible response and gift to the world. And that we move away from this need for answers, and instead we move into that space of responding. It was just so profound, and it just struck me this weekend as something I needed to hear in this moment too.
Thanks for bringing that in. Yeah, we are addicted to answers. We have all the information we need right now, right? It's not a question of information. We've got it all. We know the CO2 levels. We know the global warming. We know what's happening with the oceans. There's not an issue of data. So what is missing? Well, what's missing is that heart response, the soul response, that says that what is happening to the world is happening in my own flesh, in my own body. And I will respond as if what is happening is threatening my own existence, because it is, ultimately. So yes, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't have answers for what's going to happen. But we have to decipher your particular response. What does that look like? What is Ashlee's response? What is Charlene's response? What is my response? And then do that. Find a way to bring our response, because we think we doesn't matter. Carl Jung once had a phrase. He said that each of us is a make-weight in the future of this planet. We think we are so insignificant, so we don't even think our response matters. So we are easily kind of dissuaded from participation or from doing anything because it's so minuscule. But we don't know what we can do. Dwayne Elgin, is that a name familiar to you? Dwayne Elgin?
No.
Dwayne was
I'll need to write it down.
Beautiful writer. He wrote Voluntary Simplicity back in the 1970s, and he's been leading social change work for decades. And he just wrote a book called Choosing Earth, and I wrote the preface for it. And Choosing Earth looks at the next 5 decades and the most likely probable outcomes of what's unfolding. And it was hard to read. And then to try to write a response for that, to write a preface for that, how do you speak to that? But I did say that, the keynote for the coming decades will be sorrow. And if we are skillful at that, that doesn't mean that we're only be walking around weeping. Sorrow doesn't lead just to paralysis. It actually leads to activation. It leads to our participation, because what is sorrow tied to, but if not love, if not care? And so to feel my grief for what is happening is to say I'm willing to be touched by the sorrows of the world because of a deeper pool of connection, a deeper recognition that everything is inseparable. Everything is inseparable. What's happening in Gaza, or what's happening in Ukraine, or what's happening in any part of the planet right now. Am I immune to that? No. I can be numb to it. I can be, anesthetized to it. But if I'm willing to be a human being, then no, it's going to touch something deep in my being.
One of the things that you emphasize so much and your work has done so much is the importance of ritual and finding those pathways and finding, I think, importantly, the space where you can be held to be seen in grief, to express grief, to move away from shame or feeling judged or all of the things that hold us back from being truly vulnerable. And I know in my own work, particularly in the research and the academic side, even speaking about emotions related to climate change years ago, you faced so much ridicule, and so much sort of academic judgment and so many comments around, oh, this isn't true, this isn't real, this isn't happening. And so many of my colleagues that I worked with up north who were experiencing this as Inuit at the front lines of climate change, who were openly expressing their grief, were told, this isn't true, this isn't what you feel.
Mm.
And there's this profound backlash against the emotions. And then now here we are, almost 20 years later, where people are saying, oh yes, this is a thing. But we know people all over the world for generations have been talking about the changes and the shifts and the emotions and trying to show there are other paths to connecting. And I think your work in ritual and bringing people back to that, bringing people to the spaces of love and being seen and acceptance and being held and being in community is so profoundly needed in these times. And I'm wondering if you can speak to us more about that work that you do and the power and the profoundness of ritual.
Yeah, it's the original means by which humans recalibrated themselves, both individually and as a community, following trouble or trauma or a loss. Now it's again always up to the individual to do that. So ritual for me, really, I remember going to a continuing education class a little while ago, and it was a class with Rick Hansen, and Rick is a neuropsychologist, I should say, who's done a lot of work with Buddhism and meditation and how much those things can help us address the experiences of loss or trauma. And those are wonderful. God bless them. They're wonderful tools. But as I'm sitting in the class, I'm thinking, well, what was the original means by which we did that? And that was communal ritual. Ritual was the practice of the community to help someone or a family or a community back to sanity, back to some place of being able to regulate what has just happened. So ritual is a pitch that the psyche recognizes in an ancient way as the primary way in which we help to hold what is at times unbearable. I could tell you many stories, but I don't know if we have time for that. But what I really believe is that ritual is the means by which we are able to hold what feels overwhelming. See, grief requires two things, as I wrote about. It requires containment and release. If I'm doing this as an individual, I can't do both jobs at the same time. I can't both contain and release at the same time. So I'll never get to the release place. So I become a permanent containment field for sorrow. I keep recycling the same sorrows over and over again. In fact, what you begin to pay attention, you're recycling the same sorrows as your parents did and your grandparents. There's a generational backlog in each of us for what has not been grieved adequately. So in order to get current, we have to find ways to bring the grief to the foreground. But again, if I'm asked to do this by myself, I cannot do that. So what ritual does is it provides a fierce enough containment field, strong enough to hold our wildest emotions. When we go into grief rituals, it's intense to see people not just crying, but screaming and yelling, because outrage is also a face of grief. Grief isn't just tears, it's also protest. That what has happened to my body, what has happened to my community, what's happening to our planet is intolerable, unacceptable. And so grief also expresses itself in protest. So we have to build spaces. We have to create spaces that are potent enough to invite in, as I say, the wild edge of sorrow. Because it is wild. It is not a comfortable guest, but it's one that when it moves through us, the consequences of that are really quite profound. How much more human we feel, how much more connected we feel to one another and to the land base. But without ritual, we don't have a strong enough space within which to pour all of that material. And very few of us are ritually educated. I certainly wasn't. I mean, I was raised in a Catholic church, and they say they have rituals, and they do. They have ceremonies that are beautiful. They're lovely. They reinforce the communal bonds, but they don't disrupt me. They don't provide a space that's strong enough for me to get on my knees and weep and hold others while they're weeping. No, we come out of the church pretty much the same as we went in. I don't want to come out of ritual the same as I went in. I want to be changed by that process. I want to be reshaped by that intense encounter with the material and with one another. There's something so profoundly healing to feel side by side with other beings, weeping whatever they're weeping over. It could be the loss of their beloved cat. Doesn't matter. We're in the same territory together. And to do that side by side, God, after all this loneliness that we have felt, and how much solitary confinement we've been, sentenced to around our grief or our feelings, it's so healing. After many of our rituals, somebody will say something like, I've never done anything like that before in my life, but it felt oddly familiar. And that's, Carl Jung had a phrase. He said, there's an unforgotten wisdom at the core of the psyche. I love that phrase, an unforgotten wisdom. And when we're around the field of it, some part of us quickens. And that's what I've seen literally thousands of times. And when that frequency is struck, some part of the psyche sits up and goes, that's what I've been waiting for. That's the signal frequency that will enable me to take the next steps, to release, to let go, to feel, to fall into the arms of another. And until that frequency is struck, we kind of do the same thing. We just march along until we back our way into the grave, never really fully arriving here.
That's beautiful. And that when you talk about containment, I feel that's where I am, that I've been containing for so long. And then when you talk about release, I can feel every part of me craving, like just physically and spiritually and in my skin, my bones and my cellular level, craving that release, but also knowing that those spaces you can't just release without a particular space and a particular ritual. And I think, I can that unforgotten sort of wisdom there. I think there's that deep energetic crave, and I think I'm not alone in that so many people crave it but don't know how to get to it, that don't know how to get to the release. And that I think is, for me as a human right now, is where I am, is craving this release but stuck in containment. And these conversations and these discussions around kind of welcoming grief in and becoming larger and creating intimacy through our grief with others, when we can find those people that can hold that space and that can hold us and that can see us and hear us, is just so profound and powerful and so necessary all the time. But in these times, as we face so much coming at us in so many different ways, that the renewal of ritualization, I think, is something that many of us are craving, and I know I'm craving it as well, and just don't have the tools or the skill sets myself yet to do that.
Well, I think we underestimate
I'll
that.
need to come and take one of your sessions.
Well, like I say, it doesn't have to be a 3-day gathering. It can be an evening in someone's home, where we just sit quietly for a few minutes. We light a candle. Maybe we share a poem or a prayer. That can be enough just to start, to warm it. Alchemy talks a lot about the necessity of keeping the material warm. If we don't keep the material warm, like I said earlier, it can harden and congeal. So to keep current with grief, to at least keep our conversations current, so we can bring it into the room, we can speak to it, we can let our tears begin to fall. But we just have to make some agreements when we gather together like that, like no advice. Please don't offer anybody advice about. So grief is not a problem to be solved, right? It's not.
Mm.
It's the heart and soul's response to what it's witnessing and what it's experiencing, and doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be witnessed. So if we can provide witness for one another, that's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful beginning, and we can all do that. We're all capable of ritual. I mean, if you watch children play, they're in ritual space much of the time. They're creating imaginal territories. They're setting up sacred spaces. They're doing all kinds of interesting things. We have just forgotten how to do this. And I think it's important for us to just begin to experiment and practice with ritual, because we can't, just simply import a ritual from Africa or a Native American ritual. That I'm not that. I have to have a ritual that speaks to my own being, to my own community. And that's what I've been trying to do, is listen deeply enough. See, the earth in my imagination is a dreaming animal. And it teaches us how to be human beings. And it gives us the rituals we need in order for us to live in some kind of attunement to that dreaming being. And if we are able to do that, then the rituals allow us to live in a kind of a reciprocity and mutuality with the dreaming earth. If we don't have that anchor, then we're living on the earth. We're not living, in a sense, with or within the earth. So the rituals that have come to us here, they've been so beautiful in terms of their capacity to repair and restore the general sense of relatedness to one another and to the earth.
What a beautiful imagery to end the conversation around the earth as a dreaming animal that's inviting us into the dream space to be part of that dream and part of that creation. And that is just so stunning. And thank you for being here for this conversation, for the connection, for your works, for the gifts that you give the world, and for being one of those people who holds the space for people to have grief, to speak about grief, to follow the wild edges of sorrow, wherever it may take us. It's a truly profound thing you offer the world. And for me personally, you have been incredibly influential. So being able to have this conversation today is just so deeply and soulfully meaningful to me as well.
Well, when I began working this, it was hard to convince anybody to come to a grief ritual. you know. So to see where the work has led and to see and to hear your appreciation is deeply, deeply meaningful to me. This is what soul has asked me to do. It's asked me to track the territories of grief, shame, loss, defeat, not the happiness territories, but that's what I've been asked to work with. And so, to see that faithfulness to the work be appreciated and my medicine received, that's a gift to me. So thank you, Ashlee. And again, deep praise to
Thank you
all the
for
work
being
that you're
here.
doing. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. And I'm wondering if you would like to end our last episode of Second Nature with a quote of yours that I normally read, but I was wondering if you would do us the honor in sharing that quote with our listeners.
I'll try to remember it. It takes outrageous courage to deal with outrageous loss. So here's to courage. Here's to your willingness to show up, to love this world fearlessly. Thank you.
Thank you. This was Second Nature, Living with Ecological Grief. Thank you for joining us today for another powerful conversation about environmental love and loss. And of course, the conversation continues. So please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and visit ashleeconsolo.ca for more information. Until next time, thanks for tuning in and take good care.